Welcome to the Our Ability podcast. In this episode, we're talking with Neil Milliken. Neil is a friend of Our Abilities and one of the foremost disability accessibility experts in technology. Neil is Vice President, Global Head of Accessibility and Digital Inclusion at Atos. Hi, Neil. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you, John.
Good to have you. Thank you very much. So we've known each other for quite a while now, and we're resuming our podcast to talk about accessibility and diversity and equity and all the things that I'm afraid are being lost in the United States, certainly in the last 6 months and coming up on an election year. So trying to bring it back to the forefront. You are somebody that I look up to as far as digital accessibility, and so I wanted the listeners to listen to you, but also get a sense of where you think we are and as far as DE&I goes, as well as accessibility. But before we do that, tell people who you are and why you got interested in accessibility.
Goodness. So, I'm Milliken. I've been in the field of assistive tech and accessibility some 23-ish years now, and I fell into it. Totally by accident. I was working in a different field entirely, ended up looking for work, found an advert for a small company near where I was living that was looking for a product manager, and I'd been doing product management, and they happened to be working in the field of technology and services for people with dyslexia. And went and I didn't get the job, but they offered me a bit of temporary work, and I stayed 9 years, and made my own job, and then moved on, started working in enterprise, supporting assistive tech and accessibility. I started with Siemens, doing work for the BBC, large broadcaster, some might have heard of. In 2010, Atos bought Siemens IT services, and the rest, as they say, is history, and we've continued to build over the last decade and a bit. And Atos is a global IT services company and responsible for accessibility, both policy and program within the organization, but also all of the stuff we do for our clients. So we've got hundreds of thousands of end users around the globe, millions of workplace users around the globe, but lots of people with disabilities as part of our customer base. So want to make sure that we include them and make them as happy and fulfilled and effective in their jobs as possible.
Very cool. You mentioned broadcasting. I also came out of the broadcasting world, and I'm difficult to watch television with because I see things that I see things from a television standpoint. When you're looking at software or the internet or documents, do you always have your accessibility hat on now? And can you take it off ever?
Oh, I think there's two different things to that. So you're always aware of it, but in your spare time, do you always act on it? I think there's we're saying, being honest, if I'm doing stuff in my spare time, I'm not always going to immediately leap into action and do something. There are times when I will, but also we have limited spoons, and there's only so much energy you can put into something. So I think that when I'm doing it in my own time, of course I'm aware. But I think that I take choices about when I invest my energy. And that doesn't mean that I care less about it, but I also care enough about myself to preserve my energy for doing some of the strategic stuff. But yeah, it's around us. I'm always thinking about whether it be physical access or digital, how things might be better. I drive my people around me up the wall with constantly talking about this stuff, because the other thing is that when you say when I'm off work, well, I have my main day job, but then I've got about 6 or 7 other jobs that I've kind of acquired and accumulated over time, what with my podcasts with Devereux and Antonio Santos, and then various non-exec roles. Frankly, there's not much time left. So between sort of finishing work and sleeping.
That broadcast work is at Access Chat, which I think is wonderful, and it's one of the things I've enjoyed an awful lot. And I guess it gets to, and it reminds me of also how important accessibility is. Give me your perspective broadly on how important accessibility is in 2024 and moving forward.
I think it's actually continuing to, it's always been, right, so let's rewind. Accessibility has always been important. People's understanding of the importance of accessibility is growing for various different reasons. There's a growth in maturity. There's people have been advocating for a longer period of time now, so it's something that people have been made aware of over a period of time. We're into our second and third generation of people actually delivering accessibility. It's something that we teach now. Still a long way to go, but then we've also got things like demographics that are on the side of the importance of accessibility. We've got aging populations, and so age and disability being interrelated, suddenly it becomes much more important when a larger cohort of your population have these needs, and you haven't got a whole bunch of young people that can do it on their behalf. So we have to enable people to be independent and to be able to do stuff for themselves. So it's become a macro level strategic topic for government and society.
It has. We've spent a lot of time. We're here in the capital of New York State, near New York City, northeast of the U.S. And we, because of what Kartik has done, Kartik Sahni, our Chief Technology Officer, has done, are helping with some of the, quite frankly, state agencies, state systems, federal government agencies on digital accessibility. And I struggle with some of the misunderstandings, to be nice about it. What do you see with some of the common misunderstandings out there among businesses, governments, agencies, et cetera, on accessibility? Because it's frustrating for me when federal dollars, state dollars are not following the laws of this land and other lands on digital accessibility. What are you seeing in that area?
I see some reason to be optimistic in that I think that things are improving generally, certainly as we're seeing that as new systems are coming online, that as governments get better at digital, then they're understanding that accessibility is part of the mix. And I think that actually coming from the UK, we're privileged in that in terms of digital maturity, UK government was a leader and continues to be pretty good at digital and digitization of the state, and that they, from early days, built accessibility into that. So there's an understanding that as a consumer, usually you have a choice, but as a citizen you don't, and therefore it's incumbent upon the state to provide something that everybody can use. Now, I would like the state to provide something that everybody can use that's also nice to use, but at least they've got it functional. And so I think that in that respect, I think that, and the fact that they've open sourced it as well gives me hope, because you can see that, New Zealand have taken it, that, US government digital services are also using similar approaches. So I think that growth in maturity is something to be thankful for. is every government department spending every dollar and appropriately and making sure that they dot the I's and cross the T's? No, anywhere, right? But then there are, and I'm not wishing to make excuses for them, lots of things that are at play in the considerations that people make when they're trying to commission these services. And having worked in enterprise for the last 13 years and worked with really complex organizations, the choices that are made are always ones that are compromises. In all aspects, you've got to be compromised around security, about usability, about language. There are all of these complex variables. So I think as someone that's in enterprise doing accessibility versus people that are experts in technical accessibility, there is a difference, because quite often we're the imperfect ones, because we're having to live in that world where you broker incremental improvements, that you are taking a long-term view about where you're going. And it's that long-term view that makes the major difference over time, because yes, you can point out something, but if you're fixing one website at a time, you're not fixing systems. So we need to be looking at the systems of systems to be able to make this sustainable. That's why we look at education. That's why we're trying to build it into our university processes and into standards and into government planning on all of these things, so that it's something that kind of fixes itself over time rather than us trying to retrofit it.
Yeah, I was going to say that. Are you seeing more initial build in the enterprise world than fixing after than you have in, say, 5 years ago?
Definitely more now than 5 years ago. There are multiple drivers for this, including legislation. So we've got the European Accessibility Act. So and this is not just public sector, corporates that are providing products and services into Europe need to meet accessibility guidelines and standards. And if you don't meet the standards, then you can't sell your product. So that's a big incentive. Now, the interpretation and the guidelines still need clarification. That has meant that organizations are taking it pretty seriously, that they need to be able to do this stuff, or otherwise, they may not be able to sell their product at all.
Yeah.
So that means that as new products are being designed, they are starting to be built in. And we also see that through the efforts of many people in enterprise accessibility, through procurement, actually, that this is having an impact on the supply chain, and that this then has positive impacts on new products as they're being developed, or new versions of products as they're being developed.
That's great. That's the way it should be. That's wonderful to hear.
But it's slow. It's like if you're sort of with a child, you don't notice their growth, but the grandparents come along and go, "Oh my, little Johnny's grown." It's a bit like that with the sort of work in accessibility, because it's small increments over time. It's not big bang changes a lot of the time.
Yeah, you mentioned Europe. I was struck last year at the Zero Project conference on some of the differences between Europe and the U.S. And so one of the things Kartik and I have been talking about internally is, what are the European priorities versus what we are dealing with here. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the differences in Europe and some of the leadership that Europe's taking in? And I'm saying Europe, understanding Brexit. So I'm coming from from a very U.S. centric perspective. Sure. So I apologize.
No. But in terms of accessibility, there's more alignment than not.
Yes.
Between this little separatist island that I inhabit and the European Union. So I think that all of the governments have understood there's a need to serve their citizens on this, and so the public sector stuff has been legislated for a while now, and we're seeing that flow through into public services and so on and so forth. Now it's coming towards private sector. UK will be affected by it because, you know what, despite us wishing it otherwise, that's still our biggest trading partner. So we're going to have to make our products and services accessible if we wish to sell them to our biggest trading partner. So that's going to make a difference. So there is a willingness, I think, to make these fairly large interventions and regulate. So Europe has regulated on privacy, and GDPR has an impact on privacy around the globe. And I think to a certain extent, the European Accessibility Act will have an impact around the globe. I hope it's as big as GDPR in some ways, because it then really wakes people up. None of these pieces of legislation are without their faults. You know, I could quite do without all of these cookie consent pop-ups and all the rest of it. But Europe is prepared to put in place legislation. It's and regulation. It's not the free market, free for all, which is, we understand this as the more sort of the way that the markets have been done in North America. That, although I think is changing with some of the regulation that's coming out and the directives from the Department of Justice and so on in the US right now, which I'm thankful for. What I also want to see is harmonization, because we live in a global world, especially in technology. So if we don't harmonize this stuff, we're working to different standards. It becomes really hard to deliver because conflicting standards make it almost impossible to meet them. So we need to work together and collaborate in order for this to be effective.
We do. I left Zero Project thinking that, and then knowing we were using our artificial intelligence internally to talk about PDF accessibility, web accessibility, because it's a personal interest of Kartik and mine, obviously, being two people with disabilities. But I left there February last year thinking about that, and then listening to, as you said, Department of Justice, United States government, listening to federal contractors, and then listening to state agencies ask more and more about digital accessibility. And I'm pleasantly surprised and happy that more and more entities here in the United States are doing it. And I think it is an offshoot of what's going on. Maybe it's a positive aspect of global trading, that we want to sell our products and services around the world. And if we do, then we need to follow suit with accessibility, rights everywhere. Yeah.
So you, at the very top of the interview that we were talking about, you were talking about the challenges to DEI in the US, and how accessibility fits. I actually think that they are somewhat decoupled. Now, we've spent a long time saying, you know what, disability is the poor cousin of all of the DEI initiatives. and everybody forgets about us. And actually, what's interesting is that we've spent a lot of time, and I've essentially framed our accessibility program around ESG and sustainability, and with the social and aspects, but also you need good governance. And so whilst we do have some intersections with our diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, actually accessibility is part of governance, and it's part of the more regulatory reporting and stuff like this, which has kind of decoupled it from the politics.
Yeah.
So I think that actually accessibility is in a slightly safer place, and is actually possibly moving up the agenda where other things are starting to be deprioritized politically. So I think it's a really interesting time, and it's not that I wish for the diversity topics to be deprioritized, but because we're to a certain extent adjacent and we needed to find other ways, I don't think we're as affected by some of that politicization of identity politics that has happened, because we've got identity politics in the UK as well, but I don't think it's affecting the desire for organizations to make their products better and to comply with the regulations that are required for them to continue doing business.
I agree. And one of the reasons why I wanted to do this is because if I spend my days, again, former television person, with the financial news on behind me all day long, and I've noticed a trend in the last 9 months to that mainstream media, for whatever term that means to other people, is not talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion at all. And yet the laws are still in place that you need to be accessible digitally, physically, for people with disabilities. And so to your point of it sort of decoupled, yes. And we advocates need to remind those entities that it is still the law that your websites, your PDFs, your products, your software, your buildings need to be accessible, and you can't just ignore it as you may be ignoring DE&I in a more conservative world. And so I agree with you completely, and that's one of the reasons why we need to keep reminding people that it is the law.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's a moral obligation, but there's also legal ones behind it. But then there's also good business reasons. You don't necessarily need to stick. There are plenty of carrots for doing this as well.
I wanted to ask you that. How big is this marketplace? How big is this digital? Let's take digital alone for a second. How big is the digital accessibility marketplace out there?
That's the question I would always hesitate to answer, because the boundaries are really blurred. So, if you look at the sort of halo marketplaces of, the combined spending power, Gartner will tell you it's $8 trillion, but that's the entire spending power, and not everything, that I as a disabled person spend my money on is determined by my disability. Obviously, there's the disability tax of the things that we need to spend in order to just live our day-to-day lives that are on top of what everyone else's expenses are. And some decisions of our friends and family are impacted on. We make purchasing decisions because an organization is more inclusive, or we make purchases to go elsewhere because an organization has decided not to be inclusive. But that's quite difficult. I think the other thing is that the way that we work in enterprise is that accessibility is an element of much bigger things. So many millions within a large enterprise, and then within customer bases, and you can multiply the customer bases up, and you can see that it quickly gets to a really large number. But then also defining what is accessibility. Are we talking assistive tech? How do you define assistive tech? By some counts, the National Health Service in the UK is the world's largest investor in assistive technologies. But some of them are really, really basic. We're talking about mobility aids and crutches and things like that, whereas others are, like really advanced hearing aid technologies and, software. So I think that it's such a big and segmented market. Anyone that tells you, a buzzy figure has probably pulled it out of somewhere mentionable.
Go ahead and mention it.
Yeah.
But
so sorry not to give you an answer, but I think it is big. It's a really large market. It's growing in terms of demographic, but it's also a component of other things. It's a component in your iPhone. It's a component in your Windows operating system. Microsoft are spending a lot of money building those features, as are Apple. it's becoming more mainstream as it crosses over. So having a conversation today with Jabra, make headsets and stuff like that, but they're also owned by GN, and they make hearing aids.
Yeah.
And the boundaries are becoming blurred. So as people, use their phones to augment their hearing, where they wouldn't consider themselves to have a disability, but I can't quite hear, it needs to be a bit louder, all of these kind of things. So that sort of transitional market into accessibility, the not quite disability tech, it's just pretty handy for all of those people like my parents who were in denial for decades.
Yes.
Is also really big.
And I think that's the point of your decoupling, right? From diversity, equity, and inclusion, that disability, but accessibility is intertwined in everything. It just is. And as we age, as we evolve, as we become more technology-based, it is intertwined in everything.
Yeah. I mean, I was blown away by the size of the market for that kind of age tech in France. For example, I was speaking to Francois René Germain, who was in charge of accessibility at Orange. And they have stores, and their physical stores are selling hundreds of millions of euros worth of what is basic accessibility kit, big button phones, communication aids, all of this kind of stuff every year, hundreds of millions.
Wow. Amazing.
Yeah. These are high street stores.
Yeah. Amazing. And it's going to grow.
Yes.
What do you hope? Where are we in 5 years? Where's the disability space or the accessibility space in 5 years?
It's a really good question. I think because we're at such an inflection point politically, historically, technologically, that it's very hard to predict. We've got all of these AI technologies that everybody's really excited about. Some of those may actually prove to be useful.
Yeah.
Some of them have actually been around a very long time. Speech recognition is machine learning and natural language processing, and I've been shouting at computers for 20 odd years. But the way that they're all configured now is different, and conversational computing is getting better. I think we're right at the top of the hype cycle at the moment. So everybody's really excited that you can, tell a computer to make a picture of the Pope in a puffer jacket. But it's how do you then sort of start embedding that into the useful things that you want to do on a daily basis. And I think that when, there are instances like with Microsoft Copilot, for example, where you can tell it to do certain things and it can automate and make certain tasks easier, that it can also help make stuff more accessible, because the people that make the AI need to make sure that they're setting some implicit criteria into the AI. And I think that this is something that needs to happen, because otherwise it's going to actually accelerate inaccessibility, because people are going to just make more and more content that's not accessible. So we have huge potential, but we don't know which way it's going to go.
I agree completely. And Kartik and I talk about that all the time. The whole point of us to exist right now and what we're doing, and it's a really small universe, with recruiting and with our jobs board and matching people to jobs and the accessibility, but it's to include us in the data set, right? And if we don't include our world in the data set, then we'll be excluded, and we can't do that. And again, it's not everything. It's not the big universe we were talking about before with all of digital technology, but it's a small part. But it's so important to include people with disabilities in the mix, not exclude them.
Yes, fully agree.
Cool. Neil Milliken, I appreciate it so much. One of my favorite people to see when we get to see each other rarely in person, but also to speak to. So I very much appreciate the time you spent on our podcast, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Thank you. My pleasure.